There is a type of connection that seems too good to be true. Do you know someone? And within a few hours, the sensation is strange. It seems like this person understands you. Very. Too fast. She laughs at the same things. Agree with your opinions. He says he feels something special happening there, almost as if you've known each other for years. But actually, you met yesterday. Now stop for a second. Breathe. What if this intense connection isn't connection? What if it's engineering? Most people believe that deep connections happen naturally. What when two people meet and everything flows quickly? It means destiny, chemistry, luck. But the psychology of human behavior reveals something uncomfortable. Some people know how to manufacture this feeling. Not innocently. In a calculated way. And the most disturbing, you've probably felt this at some point. That feeling of immediate intensity. That closeness that seems to come out of nowhere. That feeling that someone sees you in a way that no one has seen before. At first, this seems rare, almost magical. But there is a curious detail that few realize. Real human connections usually take time. Trust takes time. Intimacy takes time. Truly getting to know someone takes time. The human brain needs repetition, coexistence, and shared experiences to create a bond. But when everything happens too fast, something different may be happening. And here's the question almost no one asks. Why is this person so invested in you, without really knowing you? It looks romantic, but it can be strategic. There is a well-known phenomenon in behavioral psychology called mirroring, emotional. It's when someone reproduces your tastes, your opinions, your mood, and even your expressions almost perfectly. Suddenly, you like the same songs. They have the same views on life. They share similar traumas. Coincidence? Perhaps. But sometimes, no. Some people have a very specific skill. They watch, they analyze, they capture small details about you in real time, your way of speaking, what cheers you up, what bothers you, which seems to hurt you. And then, they reflect all of that back, like an emotional mirror. Suddenly you feel something rare. You feel understood, accepted, special. But there is a disturbing detail in this process. The mirror doesn't feel. He just reflects. And when this ability appears at extreme levels, it may be associated with a profile very specific, psychological, the so-called social predator. We are not necessarily talking about criminals or murderers. That would be easy to identify. We are talking about something much quieter. People who move through society looking completely normal, charming, charismatic, interesting. But they have a central characteristic. They don't connect emotionally the same way you do. They observe people like a player observes a board. And the first move is almost always the same. Create quick connection. Very fast. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to rush intimacy? At the first meeting, they already talk about deep feelings. On the second meeting, they say they have never felt anything like this. At the third meeting, they already make plans for the future. Everything happens at maximum speed. And when you're in that experience, it's hard to realize. Because the human brain loves emotional intensity, dopamine, validation, the feeling of being chosen. Your emotional system interprets that as something rare. But here's a curious fact from psychology. Many social manipulators know exactly how to activate these emotional circuits. They know which words to use. They know when to praise. They know when to show vulnerability. They know when to create the feeling of destiny. And they do it very early. Too fast. Now I want to ask you a sincere question, and think about it calmly. Have you ever met someone who seemed perfect for the first few weeks? Someone who seemed to understand you in an almost frightening way? If this has ever happened to you, note something interesting. Many people watching here now have experienced something similar. There is almost a silent community of people who have had this experience. People who looked back months later, and they realized something was wrong from the beginning. But at that moment, it seemed too real to question. Because when someone quickly creates the feeling of deep connection, the brain human enters a dangerous state. He lets his guard down. He trusts. It opens. And it is exactly at this moment that some people begin to reveal who really are. But that rarely happens in the beginning. At first, everything seems perfect. And perhaps this is precisely what should cause distrust. Because in real life, true connections are usually slower, more imperfect, more human. When everything seems to fall into place too quickly, sometimes it's not a soulmate. Sometimes it's strategy. And in the next part of this story, we will explore something even more unsettling. Why do some people master this ability to create instant connection? And what this can reveal about their minds? Because when you understand how this dynamic really works, you begin to notice signs that previously went completely unnoticed. Signs that can completely change the way you see certain relationships. But before continuing, I want to know something from you. You think very fast connections are a sign of true chemistry? Or could they be a psychological warning? Tell us here in the comments. Because the next part of this conversation might make you reinterpret some experiences of your own life. There is a very specific moment in this type of connection. It usually happens right at the beginning, when you're still trying to understand who that person is. And suddenly, she seems to have already understood everything about you. And then the sentences begin. I feel like I can be myself with you. It's strange. It feels like I've known you for years. I've never connected like that with someone. Intense words, quick, in sequence. And the most curious thing, they seem sincere. The look sustains. The smile looks real. The attention is total. You say something small, and the person reacts as if it were deeply important. She remembers details that many people would normally ignore. The movie you casually mentioned, the story of your childhood, the insecurity you revealed almost without realizing it. Everything seems to be kept carefully. And that triggers something powerful inside the human brain. Validation. Being truly heard is a rare experience. Being seen emotionally is even rarer. So when someone appears offering this in abundance, the emotional system reacts with intensity. It's chemistry, it's empathy, it's connection. At least, that's what it seems like. But behavioral psychology has a name for this phenomenon when it appears in an exaggerated way. Love bombing, explosion of affection, an emotional avalanche. And when it happens naturally, it can even be part of the initial phase of some relationships. But when it is used strategically, the story changes. Because love bombing follows a pattern. First comes intensity, constant messages, frequent praise, absolute interest. The person seems fascinated by you, almost enchanted, and there is something seductive about that. We all want to feel like we are special to someone, that someone chose us among millions of people. So when someone demonstrates this so intensely, the human brain interprets like something rare. But there is a question that almost no one asks right now. How can someone be so sure about you without actually knowing you? Think about it. In just a few meetings, the person already says profound things. He says he's never met anyone like that. He says he feels something different. It says there is a special connection. Now imagine something curious. You reveal that you like to travel. Suddenly, she also loves traveling. You talk about a book that marked your life. Incredibly, this is also one of her favorite books. You comment on an important value for you. She agrees immediately. Everything seems aligned. Too perfect. And here's a little psychological detail that most people don't realize. When someone agrees with you a lot, your brain interprets it as deep compatibility. But sometimes it's not compatibility, it's adaptation. Some people are extremely good at reading the emotional environment. They watch, test, adjust behavior, all in real time. They understand what pleases you and amplify it. They understand what bothers you and avoid it. They understand what moves you and explore it. This creates the feeling that you are incredibly similar. But there is an important difference between two things. Be similar and look similar. This difference changes everything. Now let's do a little thought experiment. Imagine someone was studying you during a conversation, observing their reactions, noticing when your eyes shine, noticing when you are silent, noticing when you laugh more intensely. If that person started reflecting exactly those patterns back to you, what would you do? What would happen? You would probably feel something familiar, something comfortable, something almost magnetic. Because our brain tends to trust people who look like us. It's an old psychological shortcut, an evolutionary strategy. We feel safe in those who share our values and behaviors. Now imagine someone using this deliberately, someone who has mastered this skill, someone who knows exactly how to activate a feeling of connection. This is where some relationships start to get weird, but still in a very subtle way. Because while everything is happening, it just feels like emotional intensity. The person sends messages saying they were thinking about you, gives unexpected compliments. He says he admires something specific about you, not generic compliments. Personalized compliments, targeted, as if he really paid attention to every detail of you. This creates something very powerful, the feeling that you were truly seen. And this can be extremely addictive, because most people spend their entire lives wanting just that. Be understood, be recognized, be valued. So when someone appears offering all this, in large quantities, in little time, the human brain responds with enthusiasm. Confidence grows. Emotional defenses decrease. You start sharing more. Personal stories, fears, insecurities, dreams. And without realizing it, you are giving away something very valuable. Emotional information. Now notice something unsettling. For someone who has real empathy, this information creates closeness. But for someone who sees relationships as a strategy, this information becomes tools, extremely useful tools. Because when someone knows your fears, your wounds, and your desires, this person understands exactly where he can touch and when to play. But there is another curious detail in this type of dynamic, something that many people only report when they look back. At first, everything seemed too intense, almost accelerated, as if the relationship is being pushed forward quickly. Deep conversations in the first few days, premature emotional statements, plans that would normally take months to emerge, everything happening too soon. And while this happens, the brain releases dopamine, the same neurotransmitter associated with pleasure, expectation, and reward. In other words, the more emotional intensity, the more involved you feel. Now let me ask you something important. Have you ever noticed how some people come into your life like an emotional hurricane? They appear. They create intensity. They fill all the spaces. And they make you feel something extremely strong in a short time. If you've ever experienced something like this, maybe you know exactly what we're talking about here. And interestingly, many people listening to this now have also experienced similar experiences. There is almost a silent recognition going on. People who felt this intensity at the beginning, but then they realized that something wasn't completely right, because intensity is not the same thing as depth. This is a crucial distinction. Intensity can be created, depth needs to be built, and while some people build bonds slowly, others prefer to speed everything up. Very fast. Too fast. But the question that really starts to bother us when we understand this dynamic is the next. Why would anyone do this? Why would anyone invest so much energy into creating such an intense connection right from the start? The answer to that question begins to reveal something even more disturbing about the mind. Human. Because for some people, connection is not a bond, it's access. And in the next part of this investigation, we will explore something that can change completely up to how you interpret this type of behavior. How do some people manage to emotionally engineer the feeling of perfect compatibility? And why this can be one of the quietest signs of psychological manipulation. But before we go any further, there's an interesting thing that happens when we start talking about this. Many people start to remember someone specific, a face, a story, a relationship. If any of what we're discussing here sparked any memories in you, write just one word in the comments. I recognize. Because when these stories start to appear, we notice something curious. You are not the only person who has gone through this. There is a powerful illusion behind these quick connections, the illusion of perfect compatibility. But when you observe this phenomenon more closely, something curious begins to appear. Real compatibility rarely comes so instantly. It is built, tested, adjusted over time, because two different people carry different stories, different experiences, different wounds. And when these two stories meet, there is usually friction, small disagreements, moments of doubt, moments of silence. This is human. Now compare this to another situation. You meet someone, and there is practically no friction. Everything flows, everything fits, everything agrees. You say something, the person agrees. You reveal a value, she shares exactly the same. You tell an experience, and surprisingly, it experienced something almost identical. And the feeling that arises is almost magical. How can two people be so similar? But there is a question that begins to arise when we analyze this more coldly. Is this similarity real, or is it being built in real time? Because some people have extremely refined social skills. They don't just listen, they analyze every word, every break, every emotional reaction. For most people, a conversation is just an exchange of ideas. But for some specific psychological profiles, a conversation is data collection, information, emotional mapping. Imagine someone who closely observes how you react when you talk about family. Notice the tone of your voice when you mention a past relationship. Notice how his eyes change when he talks about a dream he hasn't yet fulfilled. Now imagine that this person begins to adjust their behavior based on these observations. It reinforces the points that please you. Avoid anything that could cause discomfort. And it starts to build a version of itself that seems incredibly compatible with you. This is no coincidence. This is mirroring. Mirroring is a social technique known for decades in behavioral psychology. When two people naturally connect, some level of mirroring happens unconsciously. People synchronize posture, tone of voice, pace of the conversation. But in certain cases, this process is no longer unconscious. It becomes deliberate, calculated. And when this happens with enough precision, something curious happens inside the brain. Human. You start to feel familiar, comfort, trust, as if you were in front of someone who really understands you. But here's the disturbing detail. The mirror has no identity of its own. He just reflects. And some people do exactly that in human relationships. They reflect who you are. They reflect your values. They reflect your emotions, reflect your desires, until you start to feel like you found someone rare, someone who seems almost made for you. Now imagine what happens after this sensation sets in. You lower your defenses, because when we feel that someone is similar to us, the brain interprets this as security, and security generates emotional openness. You talk more, share more, trust more, and at that moment something extremely important happens. The person on the other side gets to own something valuable, an emotional map of you, your sensitivity points, your desires, your limits, your fears, and this creates a silent imbalance in the relationship. Because as long as you believe you're getting to know someone deeply, this person may just be learning how you work, and there is a huge difference between these two things. Now here comes a point that many people only realize much later. At the beginning of the relationship, the other person seems extraordinarily attentive, extremely empathetic, always available. But as time passes, something starts to change. Small details start to slip through. Contradictions arise. Stories that don't fit together perfectly. Emotional reactions that seem strangely superficial. And you start to feel something difficult to explain. A small feeling of strangeness. But at that moment there is usually already emotional involvement. And when there is emotional involvement, the human brain does something curious. He tries to protect the narrative he has already built. Instead of questioning the connection, it tries to justify the inconsistencies. Maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe it's just a phase. Maybe I'm imagining things. Now pay attention to this sentence. Sometimes, the weird feeling is the only part of the story that isn't lying, because when someone builds an identity based solely on the reflection of another, maintaining this illusion requires constant effort, and over time, small flaws start to appear. But there is something even more interesting about this type of behavior. Psychological profiles that use intense mirroring generally have a common characteristic. They are extremely observant, extremely quick at reading people, and they have a social skill that often impresses upon first contact. Charisma, presence, ease of adaptation. But there is a question that starts to arise when we look at this more closely. Attention. Where does this ability come from? How can some people analyze human emotions so accurately? The answer may be uncomfortable, because in some cases, this ability is born from something very specific, not empathy, but in her absence. People who don't feel empathy the way most people learn from an early age to observe emotions in others. They study, imitate, reproduce, not because they feel naturally, but why do they need a rest how it works? This creates something curious, a kind of simulated empathy, an extremely convincing social performance. But at certain moments, it lets small signs of artificiality escape. Now stop for a moment and think about something. Have you ever met someone who seemed to understand human emotions very accurately, but at the same time, he didn't seem to feel these emotions deeply? Someone who knew exactly what to say, but whose emotional reactions seemed slightly disconnected. If you've ever noticed something like this in someone, know one thing. Many people have also noticed this pattern. There is almost a collective recognition happening when this topic comes up. Because when we understand how emotional mirroring works, we begin to notice something unsettling. Some connections are not discovered. They are constructed, thoroughly, piece by piece, until they look absolutely real. But there is still one question that is perhaps the most important of all. What happens when that build starts to fail? When the mask that reflected everything you were starts to slip? Because at some point in many of these stories, something changes. And when it changes, the person who seemed incredibly connected to you might reveal something completely different. Something cold. Something distant. Something that makes you wonder if that connection really existed. And it is exactly at this point that the next part of this investigation begins to get really disturbing. Because when the mirror stops reflecting, what appears behind it may be much emptier than you imagine. There is a specific moment in many of these stories, an almost imperceptible moment, but decisive. That's when something changes, not in a dramatic way, not explosively. Most of the time, it changes in subtle ways. Almost silent. The person who previously seemed intensely connected begins to experience small differences, small distances, small flaws in what previously seemed perfect. Messages no longer arrive with the same frequency. Attention decreases. Emotional availability begins to fluctuate, and most people's first reaction is curious. They don't immediately think something is wrong. They think maybe they did something wrong. Maybe they talked too much. Maybe they were too intense. Maybe they created too many expectations. Watch what happens here. When an intense connection emerges quickly, it creates a very emotional narrative. Strong. You believe you have found someone special, someone rare. So when that person starts to change, the brain tries to protect that narrative. He looks for explanations that keep the story intact. But there is one hypothesis that rarely comes first. The hypothesis that the connection was never real. This thought is difficult to accept, because to you, everything seemed true. The conversations, the laughs, the confessions, the moments of emotional intimacy. Everything seemed loaded with meaning. But there is a psychological detail here that most people are unaware of. Emotional intensity does not guarantee emotional authenticity. A person can express intense feelings without actually feeling them in the same way. You. And this happens more than we imagine, especially in psychological profiles that have something called cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy is the ability to fully understand what another person is feeling, but without necessarily sharing that feeling. In other words, the person understands their emotions, recognizes your reactions, knows exactly what to say. But internally, you are not experiencing the same emotional experience. This creates a curious situation. To you, the connection felt deep. For the other person, it may have only been functional, an interesting social interaction, an experience, or even a game. Now imagine something even more unsettling. If someone has well-developed cognitive empathy, they can simulate emotional closeness with extreme precision. She notices when you need validation, realizes when you need support, realizes when you need to hear something comforting, and it responds with exactly what your emotional brain expects. This creates the feeling of bonding. But true emotional bonding requires something more. It requires real emotional investment. And when this investment does not exist, behavior begins to reveal small fissures. Perhaps the person disappears emotionally for short periods. Perhaps you show coldness in moments where empathy would normally be expected. You may respond rationally when the situation requires sensitivity. These are small details, small inconsistencies, but they start to generate a strange sensation. And this feeling usually appears first on an intuitive level. Something inside you begins to realize that there is a void there. A heartburn, difficult to explain. Because rationally, everything still seems to make sense. But emotionally, something doesn't fit. Now there is a piece of psychology that makes this situation even more intriguing. Some people who have mild psychopathic traits, what science calls subclinical psychopathy, can operate socially in an extremely efficient way. They have jobs, friends, relationships, active social life. Nothing about them seems out of the ordinary. But there is a structural difference in emotional functioning. These people tend to experience emotions in a more superficial way, not necessarily non-existent, but reduced. This means that feelings like guilt, deep attachment, or emotional responsibility may have lower intensity. And when that mixes with refined social skills, the result can be confusing for those on the other side. Because at the beginning of the relationship, everything seems intense. But over time, something starts to feel empty, as if the connection was being sustained only by you. You invest emotionally, you worry, you get involved, but the other person seems to maintain a certain invisible distance. And when really important moments arise, she can react in an unexpectedly cold. Now stop for a moment. Think of something. Have you ever had the feeling that someone seemed emotionally present, but instead same distant time? As if you were physically there, talking, interacting. But wasn't something inside her actually connected? If this feeling has ever appeared in any relationship in your life, know that many people describe exactly the same experience. There is a strange familiarity to this kind of account. People who say things like, "At first it seemed perfect. Then something started to feel strange. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like something wasn't right." These phrases appear frequently when someone revisits this type of relationship, because when the initial connection is built on reflection and adaptation, it can feel extremely intense at first. But sustaining this over time requires something that not everyone has: real emotional involvement. And when that involvement doesn't exist, the mask starts to show cracks. Not immediately, not in a dramatic way, but in small moments, small reactions, little silences, small absences of empathy. And these moments usually generate a very specific internal reaction, a silent restlessness. Something inside you begins to realize that the person you seemed deeply connected perhaps was never really there. But there is something even more disturbing about this dynamic. Because when the initial connection was extremely intense, the human mind tends to become clinging to that first version of the person. You keep waiting for that intensity to return. May that closeness reappear. May that connection that seemed so real return. And while you're waiting for that to happen, something else could be happening. The person may just be moving on, without the same emotional weight, without the same connection, without the same internal story that you built. And when that realization finally appears clearly, she usually brings up a very uncomfortable question. Was that connection that felt so deep just a performance? But before answering that question, we need to look at a detail that many people ignore at the beginning of these relationships. A detail that appears very early, almost always, but that is usually ignored. That little internal feeling of alertness. That discrete intuition that tells you something is going too fast. In the next part of this investigation, we will talk exactly about this. The quietest signal of all. That strange feeling that many people feel at first, but choose to ignore. There is something curious about human intuition. She rarely screams. Most of the time, she whispers. A small sensation, difficult to explain, but persistent. And when we talk about connections that are too fast, this feeling tends to appear a lot early. Sometimes on the first date, sometimes in the second, sometimes at the exact moment when emotional intensity starts to feel too fast. But what do most people do at this point? Ignore it, not for lack of intelligence, but for something deeply human. When we are faced with something that looks good, we want to believe it is real. We want to believe that we have finally found someone different, someone who understands us, someone who values us. So when that little voice inside comes along saying, maybe something is fast too much, the brain does something interesting. He looks for justifications to silence her. Maybe I'm being too cautious. Maybe I'm afraid to get involved. Maybe I'm sabotaging something that could be good. These thoughts are extremely common, and they make sense, because many people carry past experiences that made them more careful emotionally. So when an intense connection arises, they fear losing the opportunity by overdoing it, of caution. But there is an important detail that is rarely discussed. Intuition is not magic, it is unconscious processing. Your brain is constantly analyzing microsignals, facial expressions, tone changes, subtle contradictions, small behaviors that go unnoticed by the conscious part of the mind. But they are still registered. And sometimes, these records generate that feeling that is difficult to explain. A slight restlessness. Now imagine that someone is being extremely charming, attentive, and intense. But at the same time, some details don't quite fit together. Maybe a story that changes slightly. Perhaps an emotional reaction that seems out of place. Perhaps a promise made too soon. Nothing big enough to seem like a clear problem, but enough to generate a little internal discomfort. This discomfort is often ignored, especially when the relationship is bringing emotional validation. Because when we feel valued, our brain releases dopamine, and dopamine has a curious effect. It reinforces behaviors that generate pleasure. In other words, when a person makes us feel special, our brain tends to seek more of that interaction, even if some signs indicate caution. Now here's something that many people only realize when they look back. That initial feeling was right. Maybe not completely, but it pointed to something real. Small patterns that were still unclear, but they were already present. Now think about how many times you've heard someone say something like, "At first I felt something was off. I ignored that feeling. I should have paid attention." These phrases appear frequently in stories of relationships that began intensely. Too much. Because the human mind has something fascinating about it. It detects patterns long before it can explain them. But there is a powerful obstacle in this process. Hope. Hope causes us to ignore uncomfortable signals, especially when we believe we've finally found something special. And it is exactly at this point that some dynamics of emotional manipulation become more effective. Because while you're busy feeling the intensity of connection, your emotional critical sense may be partially dormant. Now let me ask you a question, and answer honestly. Have you ever felt a small sense of alert at the beginning of a relationship, but decided, ignore it because everything seemed too good to question? If this has ever happened to you, know that it is not uncommon. In fact, many people who follow discussions about human behavior have been through something similar. There is almost a silent network of people who, looking back, realize the same signs. The early intensity, the seemingly perfect connection, and that little voice inside saying, something is moving too fast. But there is another curious detail. When the relationship continues, this feeling may disappear for a while, especially if the person continues to offer emotional validation, attention, and proximity. This creates a kind of emotional cycle, intense moments of connection, followed by small moments of strangeness. But as positive moments are stronger, the mind tends to prioritize them until something starts to change. The intensity decreases, attention fluctuates, and that feeling that seemed small at first comes back. But now it comes with more difficult questions. Why did this person change? Why doesn't she look the same anymore? Did I do something wrong? Observe how the human mind reacts at this point. Instead of questioning the authenticity of the initial connection, many people question themselves same. They look for their own mistakes. They try to recover the intensity from the beginning. They try to understand what happened. But here's something fundamental that many people are slow to realize. If a connection needs to be constantly proven, constantly restored, constantly rescued, maybe she was never as solid as she seemed. Healthy human connections typically evolve over time. They don't just depend on intense moments. They create stability, consistency, gradual confidence. But when a relationship starts off like an emotional wildfire, sometimes it can also disappear just as quickly. And when that happens, many people get a strange feeling, as if they had experienced something that seemed profoundly real. But at the same time, it leaves doubts. Was it true? Was it emotional exaggeration? Or was it something more complex? Now think about something curious. When many people begin to study the psychology of human relationships, they discover that certain patterns repeat themselves, especially in relationships where there is emotional manipulation. The initial intensity, the connection speeds up, the mirroring of values, and then behavioral changes that create confusion. But there is still an important piece to this puzzle, because when the social mask starts to slip, some people reveal something very specific, an emotional coldness that was previously completely hidden. And when that happens, the difference between the person you met at the beginning and the person who appears later can be surprising. In the next part of our investigation, we will talk exactly about this moment, the moment the mask starts to fall. And when that happens, the connection that seemed intense can reveal something much more calculated than emotional. There is a point in many of these stories where something clearly changes. It's not just a feeling anymore. It's no longer just a vague intuition. Now there are concrete behaviors that begin to generate confusion. The person who previously seemed extremely involved starts acting differently. Messages that were once quick now take time. Conversations that were once deep now become superficial. The attention that previously seemed constant begins to waver, and when that happens, many people feel a kind of emotional shock. Silent, because the difference between the beginning and now seems too big. But there is something even more intriguing at this moment. Change is rarely complete. It happens in cycles. Sometimes the person shows intensity again, send loving messages again, go back to acting like you did at the beginning. And for a moment, everything seems normal again. But then the distance returns. This kind of dynamic creates something powerful inside the human brain. Emotional confusion. Because when something positive appears intermittently, it becomes even more addictive. This phenomenon is known in psychology as intermittent reinforcement, the same mechanism that keeps people trapped in gambling. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, and that's exactly why he keeps playing. In human relationships, this pattern can have a similar effect. Moments of affection, followed by moments of coldness, moments of closeness, followed by distancing. And while this happens, the person who is emotionally invested tries to understand what is happening. It attempts to restore the initial connection. Try to recover that intensity that seemed so true, but there is something that is rarely noticed immediately. For some people, this change is not confusion, it's control. Because when someone strategically alternates proximity and distance, it creates an emotional imbalance. The other person begins to seek approval. It seeks to recover the moment when everything seemed perfect. Now let me ask you a question. Have you ever noticed how some people can be incredibly charismatic in at first, but then they seem emotionally distant, almost as if there were two versions of them, the initial version and the version that appears later. This difference is often surprising, but when we look at certain psychological profiles, it starts to make sense. Some people have something called superficial charm, a characteristic often studied in psychopathic profiles. Superficial charm doesn't mean a person is fake all the time. It means she has extremely efficient social skills. She knows how to make a good impression. You know how to look interesting, knows how to create a quick connection. But this connection is often not supported by emotional depth. It is functional, useful, strategic. Now think about something curious. When someone has this ability, the beginning of relationships can be extremely surrounding. The person seems safe, funny, interesting, pay attention. But as time passes, the initial intensity begins to decrease. And when more emotionally complex situations arise, something different may appear. Distancing, indifference, or even impatience. And this creates a strange experience for those on the other side. Because the emotional memory of the beginning of the relationship is still alive, you remember the connection, remember the intensity, remember the feeling of being understood. So, when the other person starts acting cold or distant, the contrast becomes difficult to understand. Now, there is a very interesting psychological point here. The human brain has difficulty accepting that two very different versions of one person can coexist. Then he tries to reconcile these versions. Maybe that person is going through problems. Maybe she's stressed. Maybe you need space. These explanations may even be true in some situations. But in others, they just hide something simpler. The initial version may be naked, never been completely real. Maybe it was an adaptation, a social performance. And when the effort to sustain this performance diminishes, the most authentic version starts to appear. Now notice an important detail. When this change happens, some people react in very specific ways. They begin to test limits, small tests, maybe a colder answer, perhaps an unexpected criticism, perhaps a comment that creates discomfort. These moments reveal something interesting. How you react. Because for certain manipulative profiles, understanding their emotional limits is extremely useful. If you accept small, uncomfortable behaviors, the person learns that they can go a little further. If you question it, she may back off temporarily, and then try again. This creates a silent dynamic of power adjustment within the relationship. But the most curious thing is that many people do not notice this process while it is happening. Happens. They are busy trying to regain the initial connection, trying to go back to the moment when everything seemed easy. But there is something fundamental that we need to consider. When a relationship begins based on artificial intensity, maintaining that intensity requires constant effort, and not everyone is willing to sustain this construction for a long time. Then little by little, small changes appear, small coldness, small absences of empathy, small inconsistencies, and these changes begin to reveal something that was hidden behind the social mask. Now stop for a moment. Think of something. Have you ever met someone who seemed incredibly engaging at first, but then time revealed an unexpected emotional coldness? If this has ever happened to you, perhaps you know exactly how many people feel. Describe. Confusion, doubt, and a question that slowly begins to emerge. Who was that person at the beginning? Because when the difference between the two versions becomes too big, something starts to change. Be clear. The connection that seemed spontaneous may have been built with a very special purpose. Specific. But there is still an aspect of this dynamic that makes everything even more complex. Because some of these people don't see relationships the same way as most of people. For them, human connections can act as tools. How to access. As an opportunity. In the next part of our investigation, we will explore exactly this profile psychological. The so-called modern social predator. People who can navigate human relationships with charm, intelligence, and adaptation. But they see these relationships in a very different way than most people. And when you understand how these minds work, some behaviors that once seemed merely confusing begin to do much more sense. There is a type of person who passes through society almost invisible. not because he hides, but because it seems absolutely normal. She works, conversation, laugh. He has friends. It may even appear extremely sociable. In fact, he often appears more sociable than average, charismatic, trusting, interesting. Someone who arrives in a room and quickly attracts attention. But there is something curious about this type of profile. The way he sees human relationships may be profoundly different from the most people. For many people, relationships are emotional experiences, bond, companionship, history construction. But for some specific psychological profiles, relationships can work differently like barter systems, like opportunities, how to access. And this is where a concept studied by modern behavioral psychology emerges, the so-called social predator. The word may seem strong, but it does not necessarily mean physical violence or criminal behavior. In fact, many social predators are extremely successful in professional and social. They understand people, they read emotions, they perceive vulnerabilities, and they know exactly how to adapt to different contexts. Now think about something curious. If someone has an extraordinary ability to observe people, interpret behaviors, and adjust one's own social image, this person can become extremely efficient at creating quick connections, because she knows exactly which emotional buttons to press. She notices those who seek validation, who seeks recognition, who seeks protection, who seeks admiration, and adapt your posture accordingly. But there is a fundamental detail that differentiates these profiles of highly qualified people: empathetic. True empathy involves emotional involvement. Social predators may possess something different. Emotional reading. They understand how you feel, but that doesn't mean they share that feeling. Now imagine what happens when someone with this profile enters a relationship. The beginning can be extremely engaging, because this person knows how to create an impact. It knows how to be interesting. You know how to make others feel special. But at the same time, the relationship may have an implicit objective. Maybe social access, maybe validation, maybe convenience, maybe just encouragement. And when the goal is achieved or interest wanes, emotional intensity can disappear surprisingly quickly. This is why some people describe very specific experiences after relationships like that. They say things like, "At first it seemed incredible. It felt like that person completely understood me. Then it seemed like she just lost interest." And this change can be difficult to understand, because for those who were emotionally involved, the connection felt deep. But for those who were conducting the interaction strategically, the experience may have been much more superficial. Now there is a curious fact in the psychology of subclinical psychopathy. Not all individuals with psychopathic traits are violent. In fact, many operate perfectly within social norms, but they have some specific characteristics: superficial charm, search for stimulation, low emotional empathy, ease of manipulating perceptions, and a more utilitarian relationship with human bonds. This does not mean that every charismatic or sociable person has this profile, of course. But when certain characteristics appear together, patterns begin to emerge: fast connections, initial intensity, emotional mirroring, abrupt changes in behavior, distancing when interest wanes. Now stop for a moment. Notice something important. Most of these people do not see themselves as manipulative. In their own minds, they are just navigating relationships the way they know how, seeking stimulation, seeking advantage, seeking experiences. But for those on the other side, the experience can be completely different. It can feel like a deep connection has been built, and then just discarded. And this raises a question that many people ask when they begin to reflect on these experiences. Did that person really care about me? Sometimes the answer is complex, because some people can show momentary interest, but this interest may not have the same emotional depth as you imagined. Now here is an important point that many people begin to realize when study human behavior. Some of the most charismatic people we encounter throughout our lives can also be the hardest to really know, because they have mastered the art of social adaptation. They show exactly what each person expects to see, but they rarely reveal who they really are. This creates a curious sensation. You feel like you know that person deeply, but at the same time, She realizes that there are parts of her that remain completely inaccessible, almost as if there was a door that never opens. Now let me ask you a question. Have you ever met someone who seemed incredibly interesting, but at the same time seemed impossible to completely decipher? Someone who changed their behavior depending on the environment, which seemed to adapt perfectly to different people, but whose true identity always seemed a little distant. If you've ever noticed this in someone, perhaps you've noticed something that many people ignore. Some people are masters at constructing social masks, extremely convincing masks, but they mainly serve to navigate social environments efficiently. And when you start to understand how these masks work, some past experiences start to make more sense. The initial intensity, the quick connection, the feeling of perfect compatibility, and then the unexpected coldness. But there is one last reflection that makes all of this even more interesting. Not every quick connection is manipulation. Not all intensity is artificial. Human beings are too complex for simple explanations. But when specific patterns repeat, it's worth watching. It's worth asking. It's worth paying attention to that silent sensation that appears when something seems too good to be completely true. And it is exactly with this reflection that we reach the final point of this investigation. Because when you understand how these dynamics work, you start to look at human connections with a little closer eye, a little more aware, and maybe a little more protected. Next time we will talk about something fundamental, the silent warning that many people ignore when a connection starts too quickly. There is a silent question that runs through all these stories, a question that many people only ask when they are already looking back, when it's all over, when the intensity passed, when the confusion, the emotional state finally begins to organize itself. The question is simple, but deeply uncomfortable. Was that connection real, or was it constructed? Because when someone lives an experience like this, something curious happens in their memory. The beginning of the relationship remains extremely vivid. The conversations, the moments of closeness, the words that seemed so sincere. But at the same time, a strange feeling arises, as if those memories existed within a story that now seems incomplete, almost like a puzzle where some pieces no longer fit. And this happens because when a connection starts too intense, the brain creates quickly deliver a powerful emotional narrative. You believe you have found something rare, something different, something special. And when that narrative starts to unravel, the emotional impact can be great. But there is an important reflection that many people only discover later. Not every intense connection is deep, and not all emotional intensity is proof of true bonding. Sometimes intensity is just stimulation, speed, impact. But real depth is often quieter. It grows slowly, with time, with coexistence, with small imperfect moments that reveal who people really are. Now think of something. When two people really get to know each other over time, they inevitably small conflicts, moments of disagreement, and it doesn't destroy the connection. In fact, it often strengthens. Because it is in these moments that authenticity appears. But when a relationship seems too perfect at first, no conflicts, no friction, no gray areas. Sometimes this can mean something very specific. You're still not seeing the real person. You are looking at a carefully adapted version. Now let me share something that many psychologists observe when studying relationships human. People who have manipulative or psychopathic traits rarely reveal who they are at the beginning. They reveal who you wish they were, and this creates a powerful illusion. Because when someone seems to understand your values, your dreams, and your pains with perfection, the brain interprets this as deep compatibility. But true compatibility can only be tested over time, in difficult situations, in moments of frustration, in circumstances where the social mask can no longer sustain itself. Now there is an interesting detail about all this. When you learn to observe these patterns, something changes in the way you see relationships. You start paying attention to something that previously went unnoticed. Rhythm, emotional speed, consistency between words and behavior. Because healthy human connections rarely need to rush. They walk. They build themselves. They reveal themselves little by little. Now think about something important. If someone tries to rush emotional intimacy too soon, maybe this person is trying to get somewhere specific before you have time to observe calmly. And that doesn't mean you should distrust everyone. It does not mean living in a constant state of suspicion, but it means something much simpler: conscience, awareness of how human connections develop, awareness of how some people use emotional intensity as a tool, and awareness about the value of time. Time reveals patterns. Time reveals inconsistencies. Time reveals who is really present and who only appears to be. Now I want to ask you an important question, and answer honestly. Do you think true connections need to happen quickly, or do you believe that the strongest relationships are those that build slowly? Write your opinion in the comments, because when many people start sharing experiences on this topic, something interesting happens. Stories start to appear. Stories of relationships that started like an emotional wildfire and ended leaving difficult questions. And maybe someone reading these comments will notice something they never noticed before. Maybe someone will recognize a pattern. Perhaps someone understands a past experience in a completely different way. And if this reflection made you look at certain connections more clearly, maybe it's worth sharing this video with someone who is also interested in understand the human mind in a deeper way. Because there is one thing that unites all the people who are here now: a curiosity, a desire to understand what really happens behind social masks. And when you start to develop that look, something changes. You still allow yourself to meet people. You still allow yourself to feel. But learn to observe. Learn to notice when something seems too fast. Learn to trust more in that little internal sensation that appears when something doesn't work. Fits. And perhaps this is the true psychological protection, not constant distrust, but awareness. Because at the end of the day, not every fast connection is a target signal. Sometimes, it's just someone who's really good at looking like exactly what you wanted to find. And when you learn to recognize this, the way you see human relationships will never be the same again.